So I'm out here on the front patio. It's roughly 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So I have this basic question. I now have 2 thermal typewriters. The real question is, are thermal typewriters really typewriters? Of course, this becomes a topic of discussion because if you go back to the June of 2018, I made a visit out to Phoenix, Arizona for the summer Phoenix Type-In. And while I was there, I visited with the Right Reverend Ted Monk, and he showed me some of his typewriter collection. And a couple of the typewriters he had a Brother EP20, I think it was, and a Canon Typestar 4 thermal typewriters. And that was really the first time I'd had a chance to actually use them and play with them, and I was favorably impressed. I especially liked the form factor, the size, the lightweight, the not silent but pretty quiet operation. So when I got back to Albuquerque that summer, I started looking around for a thermal typewriter, and I ended up finding one on eBay, a Brother EP20, and I did pick it up, and you've probably seen, I've made a couple videos about it, certainly. And the previous video to this particular video was having acquired a Canon Typestar 4 off of an online seller, and so I did this comparison between the Brother and the Canon, and sort of a general review of thermal typewriters and their general features and attributes and the good and the bad, the pluses and minuses of them. So that has me thinking about the efficacy of thermal typewriters in an era when manual typewriters are so well appreciated these days. I think what a lot of us like about typewriters is their mechanical nature. You know, the whole thing about the direct connection between your fingers and the linkages and being able to feel the mechanical feedback of the mechanism as it strikes the platen in your fingers. And the fact that because they're mechanical, they're independent of a power source, and smaller typewriters are easy to carry, relatively easy. You can take them places where you don't expect to have power and all that. So they have those attributes, those advantages. And there's a certain aesthetic, of course, to manual typewriters, and the fact that they're mechanical. That's another attribute, right? Mechanical nature of typewriters we love. The mid-1950s, Smith Corona made the Smith Corona electric typewriters. And these were very much the same, based on the same mechanics, the same chassis as the 5 Series manual machines from the 50s. But they had a little bit larger body size. They had a motor, some drive belts, a couple drive spindles, and the linkages for the type bars were just a little bit different. But you still hit the keys, the type bars fly up, fabric ribbon, cloth ribbon, a regular carriage with a rubber platen, and the carriage operates with an escapement, and you do a manual carriage return, the whole thing with a spring motor, just like a manual typewriter, except the type bars are operated electrically and the space bar is also. You know, that's the first step away from a purely manual machine, and you kind of have to ask yourself, well, is that acceptable? Is that an acceptable typewriter, whatever that means, right? You'd be hard-pressed to say otherwise. Yeah, it's a valid typewriter. It's electromechanical, driven by a motor, but it's very much a manual typewriter in every other sense of the word. So then we go into the era of the 1960s, and we have IBM Selectric machines being introduced, and they're also electromechanical. They don't have any electronics in them. They're operated by a motor, and everything else is mechanical. I think the major change that happens with the IBM Selectric is going to the carbon film ribbon. I think that's the dramatic change there. And that introduces the idea of a one-time use only ribbon. And maybe that is the most objectionable part about electric typewriters. For myself personally, the fact that the ribbon cartridges are one-time use only, what it means for me is that every time I strike a letter, I strike a character, I'm using ribbon, and it's going to cost me money. Because it's a one-time use ribbon, it only has so many characters you can print on that ribbon, and when it's done, you have to pull it out of the machine and find a replacement, or you can't type. Whereas with a manual typewriter with a cloth ribbon, you can use it over and over and over again, and it fails gently. It fails gracefully in the sense that it just slowly fades out and gets fainter and fainter. And you have to make the decision at what point is it required to replace, right? But a lot of these, like daisy wheel typewriters of the 1980s, they're not only using the carbon film ribbon of the IBM Selectrics, but now they introduce the concept of electronics. So the whole control circuitry that operates the daisy wheel and operates the carriage mechanism that slides back and forth on the little cable and the drive rod, that whole thing is operated by some microprocessor kind of controller. It is electronic, and so it is certainly several steps removed from manual typewriters. If you try them, you have this experience of oftentimes the machines that aren't that good, they have this delay between pressing the key and seeing the letter printed on paper. And the delay varies based on the model and the brand and the feature set. I think I've seen where the machines that have a lot more memory features often and make a spell correction, auto correction thing like that, a dictionary, oftentimes those typewriters are slower because every character, every word you're typing is buffered through a memory, and it kind of has to compare the word against the dictionary to see if it's a valid word, otherwise it'll beep at you. So there's a lot of like digital logic behind the scenes that is slowing down the functioning of the machine. It's not as speedy, not as responsive, right, as a manual typewriter. And that's the big objection I have. If you compare the electrified Smith Corona from the 1950s, they are certainly responsive. And the 6 Series, the electrified 6 Series, like the automatic coronets and things like that, those things are swift. And you just move your fingers and they just put down letters on paper like nobody's business. But when you get into the daisy wheel typewriters, they're oftentimes not that fast. The exceptions being, like that I know of, are, for instance, the IBM Wheelwriters. Those are very, very responsive. Yeah, so we have several stages of evolution away from the classic manual typewriter with a cloth ribbon and manual operation. You first have the electrified manual with a drive spindle driven by a motor, and your manual key entry causes a linkage to interject itself into the spindle teeth, and that flips the type bar up, right? But everything else is pretty much manual. To a more complex electromechanical mechanism of the IBM Selectric with a dramatically different carbon film ribbon. It's not really ink anymore. It's just a film of some kind of carbonous resin that gets imprinted right on the paper, but it's still printing a mark on paper. To the fully microprocessor, electronic controlled daisy wheel typewriter, incorporating both carbon film ribbons and this computerized electronic system of the 1980s and maybe 90s. So those are the dramatic changes in typewriters that we get up to the point where now, in the late 80s, several companies, I know for sure Brother and Canon and maybe Epson, introduced the idea of a thermal typewriter, where instead of using impact technology like the mechanical imprint of a daisy wheel or a golf ball in the case of the Selectric, instead of that, impacting a carbon film and transferring the impression through the film onto paper, you have a thermal print head. It's a pixelated little device that's driven digitally that forms letters in a digital arrangement, and it heats up a carbon or a plastic film ribbon that has a material on the paper side that will transfer itself to paper when it is heated. And so that is another step beyond the classic daisy wheel electronic typewriter. These thermal typewriters are, yes, electronic, and they are making an impression on paper. It's not really ink. It's similar to carbon film, but it's a thermally transferred carbon film. And then we get up to the present point in time where these cartridges in the thermal typewriters aren't available anymore except on the used market as new old stock. And so the most economical way to operate these typewriters ends up being using thermal paper itself, like thermal fax paper and thermal cash register paper, whatever. So again, another 2 steps of change away from where we came from with the manual typewriter, electrified manuals, carbon film electromechanical typewriters, carbon film electronic typewriters, then thermal electronic typewriters, printing onto paper with a special ribbon cartridge, and then thermal electronic typewriters printing onto thermal paper. And that's where we come up to the present time with the big question, are these typewriters? So as I thought about this question, what struck me was the question really needs to be asked is, what is a typewriter? What does that word mean? And oddly enough, the thought came to me while I was typing ideas up on the Canon Typestar typewriter, Typestar 4 typewriter, ironically enough. Okay, so the word typewriter is like a compound word. It's composed of type and writer. And so those two words have their own legacy, their own history, right? So type, what does type mean? Well, type really gets back to Gutenberg's invention of a cast metal impression, a cast metal letter that you can then use to transfer an ink onto paper, right? And that's pretty much where the manual typewriter gets into. The manual typewriter is sort of the end state of the Gutenberg technology, I would say, or at least it's a branch of Gutenberg technology into, instead of whole sheets of cases of type being laid down together in parallel, you're imprinting individual letters one at a time onto paper. But the technology is very similar. Well, what does it mean to have type when you don't really have these little cast metal die or type slugs? Is it really type when it is a thermal printhead? That's the first good question. And then the second part of that question is the second part of that compound word, the writer part. So what is a typewriter as a machine? Is a machine that writes. And what does it fundamentally mean to write? Well, fundamentally, at its most essential nature, writing is putting marks down, visibly legible marks on a flat surface. It doesn't necessarily even have to be paper, and at one time in human history, it wasn't paper, it was maybe papyrus or leather or stone or clay tablets, right? But they were a flat surface with some kind of engraved or etched or imprinted markings. And so when we get to the idea of a writer machine, really it is a machine that makes marks on a flat surface. In the case of a daisy wheel, it is little plastic pedals with the engraved letters, right? In the case of a IBM Selectric golf ball element, it is cast in aluminum or something, light metal. But in the thermal typewriters, it's not a physical raised impression. It's really transfer by heat, but it's making a mark nonetheless. It's like taking the burnt end of a stick that's been in the fire and making a charcoal marking on a cave wall is very close to what a thermal typewriter is. It's using the after effects of heat to change the nature of some material so you can transfer a mark on another surface. So I guess in that sense, you could probably argue that, yeah, I think a thermal typewriter, even using thermal paper only, it's probably a typewriter in the loosest sense. It's just very different from mechanical or electromechanical typing with raised, engraved, or raised letters making a mechanical, physical impression of ink on paper. Well, perhaps there's another way to approach the question of are thermal typewriters really typewriters, and that is more of the functionality, what you do with them. But you take a laptop computer out and you're going to sit down and you have this screen, but what you're doing on that is you're not directly writing to a paper-like surface. You're just recording data in some digital format, really. Then, if you compare that to taking a thermal typewriter out in public, functionally speaking, it has a lot of similarities. Like the Canon TypeStar looks a lot like a laptop computer of a few years or decades ago. It's battery powered, very similar to the way a laptop computer is battery powered. Fairly quiet, like a laptop computer is fairly quiet. So, and it's electronic. There's electronics in it. There's even a little LCD screen to help you do corrections while you're typing. The fundamental difference, I think, comes down to the fact that in the case of thermal typewriters, you are printing or you're recording text to paper. It's not being recorded to any kind of a digital media. It is recorded to paper. It's making marks on paper. They really do become kind of like the end state of the typewriter. It is a paper imprinting device. And I'm using the term imprinting in terms of thermal paper in the loosest sense possible of the word. It is printing in the sense that marks on paper. I think in that sense, looking at that whole historical spread of technology, I think thermal typewriters are typewriters, but they are the end state of the typewriter. But what makes them the essential typewriter-ness of a thermal typewriter is really that it's writing to paper. Paper is its medium. Then there's the question of, is the paper medium of thermal paper, thermal printing paper, is it a valid medium, and is it archival? So thermal paper printing is probably about on the par with magnetic recording, I'd say. I have purchased many books over the years where I saved the receipt from the bookstore, and I put the receipt in the book as a bookmark, and I put the book on my shelf, and I've had these books for 10, 20, 30 or more years. And you go back, you thumb through the book, you find the receipt, and you can still read the receipt, right? It's still faint, but it's still there. And so it depends on how well the book was stored, the temperature conditions, and heat, and exposure to light, and all that, right? But I have microcassette magnetic tape recordings from the late 1970s that are still have a signal, but the signal's degraded. It's obviously noisy. There's hiss. So it's degraded somewhat, and it's that typical analog format of degradation that just degrades slowly over time, right? So that's kind of the way the thermal paper, it degrades gracefully, and it depends on the conditions that it's been stored in. I remember I had a composition book that had a plastic black cover laminated to cardboard. I had a receipt of some kind in the notebook. I left it in my car in the sun in the summer in Albuquerque. Car got really warm. I came back out later, and the receipt was completely black. Right. So it depends on what condition you store the thermal printing in is how well it lasts. And obviously you could imagine setting your cassette tape on top of a strong magnetic field. You might have the same experience with that kind of problem, or like floppy disks. Anyway, all those magnetic media kind of remind me of thermal printed paper because they all have that intrinsic degradation. They're sensitive to their environment. They're not absolutely archival. And so the question of, are thermal typewriters valid typewriters, and is thermal paper a valid medium to write on, really depends on what you're doing with the paper. What are you doing with those writings? And in the case of writings that are generated by thermal printing technology, I think the use case is really best argued to be like in the early stages of writing, the first draft, the early stages, the brainstorming, I just need to get away from all the busyness of life and the distractions. I need to sit down somewhere like a cafe, coffee shop, restaurant or somewhere and just put some words down on paper that it's just the raw stuff that I'm going to use later on to make some more finished work. And so the process sort of starts off in this semi-permanent or really temporary media. And then you take that writing you've done on thermal paper, you might hand scribble notes, scratch out, do some edits, revisions, and then you're going to transcribe it either onto a ink on paper typewriter or into a computer, into a word processor, right? So the question of whether thermal electric printing needs to be archival is really depending on what you're doing with it. And I would argue that in this kind of a use case, it probably doesn't need to be. that permanent. It just needs to be permanent enough for you to be able to take those words and transcribe them and start using them in the process of writing something else, right? Something more polished, more finished. One of the primary uses, best use cases for thermal typewriters is really the mobile approach. In other words, if you were writing from a fixed location somewhere at home, your writing space, a desk, a little shack, a shed in the backyard, wherever it is, in the attic, in the basement, you probably wouldn't be choosing a thermal typewriter as your first option because you're in a fixed location. You could have a massive 40-pound iron boat anchor of a, Underwood 5 or something, sitting there. It doesn't matter. Where the thermal typewriters come into play is the fact that they're portable, they're battery powered, they're lightweight, easy to carry. You can put them in a little laptop computer bag and carry them anywhere, and they're quiet. See, this is the real prime use case. The argument for these machines is where the thermal typewriter shines is the fact that it's quiet. None of those other typewriters are quiet. You can use a thermal typewriter in any public space, and it's not going to bother anybody else. Even my EP20, the brother, the little clicky noises it makes when it does the carriage return, that's not really that objectionable. It's not like the clattering of a typewriter. And you could probably hide that sound by picking up your coffee cup and setting it down on the table or on the little saucer. That sound alone would probably be louder than the typewriter doing the carriage return. So that's the best use case, I think, of these machines, and that kind of defines how you might be using these thermal typewriters, right? Going out in public somewhere to write. And so that kind of argues for a writing methodology that may not suit everybody. Not everybody that dabbles in words prefers to write in public. Some people thrive on the distraction, kind of the noise, the hum of the busy coffee shop or the cafe. They like the inspiration it brings. And it's also a different place from home. It's somebody else's space. It's not your space. But it has a different feel, and it might induce different thoughts. And you're out in public, you can observe other people around you, and that might give you inspiration for ideas, for your character or whatever. So not everybody writes like that. Not everybody likes to write in public. Maybe you're a solitary lone writer in your little castle at home, hidden away, or you might be the mobile writer. But if you're a mobile writer and you want to use a paper typewriter-like workflow, that I think is that one particular use case where the thermal typewriters do shine. And in that regard, I would probably say, to sum all this up, are they valid typewriters? Are they typewriters? Yes, they are in the loosest sense of the word. They are putting impression on paper. They are a paper-only medium. So they do write and they do produce type on paper, and they're mobile, portable. The fact that they're battery-powered and controlled by electronics is sort of incidental to the whole argument, I think. Why is that an important question? Why is the question of whether they're valid typewriters, why is that important, or is there any importance at all to that question? I think some of it has to do with the fact that the revival of typewriters we've seen in the last decade or so, a lot of that has been driven by nostalgia for mechanical devices that are so foreign to us in our current culture. It harkens back to a previous age, kind of industrial revolution days, pre-electronic. And I certainly appreciate that aesthetic. I am driven and passionately interested in typewriters for the mechanical aspects of it. But that's not the only avenue of typewriter technology. I appreciate Steve Kay of the Right Elephant blog, who has spent the last few years carefully documenting the world of electronic daisy wheel typewriters, for instance. I appreciate his knowledge and his thoroughness, because that's one corner of the typewriter world that hasn't been as well covered by other people, other aficionados in the typewriter world. It doesn't draw people with the same aesthetic urge as a lovely old black, shiny, round-keyed machine from the early part of the 20th century does. Different build quality, different economic model, different technology, different market perhaps, but they are certainly typewriters. They do put impressions of ink-like material on paper. So they have a valid use, I think. And they are indeed non-distractive. Whatever argument you use for the efficacy of typewriters, I think thermal typewriters and daisy wheel electronic typewriters certainly play into that. They do offer a distraction-free writing experience of ink on paper. They offer various convenience levels of correctability. Correcting and editing are two different things. You intended to write the word help, but you wrote the word hell. But you can correct it before it gets on paper, so it says help. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the word help was the right word, or that paragraph is the right paragraph, or the sentence is worded properly. That's a whole nother ball of wax in the writing process. That's the editing phase of writing. And that's not really what typewriters are well suited for, regardless whether they're electronic, daisy wheel with a bunch of memory or whatever. They're not as well suited for that editing phase as they are for the first draft phase of writing. This is Joe Van Cleve, and no, this is not a vlog. Have yourselves a great day, everybody. Bye-bye for now.